In Chapter 4, we will talk about congruence, and in particular congruent triangles. For right now, we will look at congruent figures. So congruent polygons have congruent corresponding parts, which means their angles and sides are congruent. When you name congruent polygons, always list corresponding vertices in the same order. Let's look at two examples where we name congruent parts. In the first one, we have triangle ABC is congruent to triangle XYZ. So for my congruent sides, I can have that side AB is congruent to side XY. Side AC is congruent to side XZ. And finally, side CB is congruent to side ZY. For my angles, angle A is congruent to angle X. Angle C is congruent to angle Z. Oops. And angle B is congruent to angle Y. And we know that since the triangles are congruent, it makes all their sides and all their angles congruent. In our second example, we have a quadrilateral. It says quadrilateral PACE is congruent to quadrilateral FISH. So again, let's list our congruent sides and angles. So side PA is congruent to side FI. Side AC is congruent to side IS. Side CE is congruent to side SH. And side EP is congruent to side HF. And then for our angles, angle P is congruent to angle F. Angle A is congruent to angle I. Angle C is congruent to angle S. And angle E is congruent to angle H. If you have difficulty telling which side or which angle is congruent to the other, just go back to your congruent statement. So this right here is our congruent statement, and it matches up in order, how P goes with F, and A goes with I, and so on. Two triangles are congruent when they have three pairs of congruent corresponding sides and three pairs of congruent corresponding angles. The triangle angle theorem, which is our first theorem in this chapter, says if two angles of a triangle are congruent to two angles of another triangle, then the third angles are congruent. Number 1 says decide whether the triangles are congruent. If so, write them as congruent with their corresponding parts. So remember from our theorem, it says that two triangles are congruent when they have three pairs of congruent corresponding sides and three pairs of congruent corresponding angles. So in the first triangles, we see by these marks that these two corresponding sides are congruent. We see that side MN and MK are both 6. So there's another pair of corresponding congruent sides. And NJ is 8, and so is KL. So there's our third pair of corresponding congruent sides. Then we have angle N is 82, angle K is 82. So there's a pair of corresponding congruent angles. Now from last chapter, remember, we have vertical angles, angle NMJ and angle KML. So there's a second pair of congruent corresponding angles. And then our triangle angle theorem said that if we had two congruent angles congruent to two congruent angles in another triangle, then that makes the third angles congruent. So we have enough information in number 1 to prove that these two triangles are congruent. So let's list our corresponding parts. So side LK is congruent to side JN. Side KM is congruent to NM. LM is congruent to JM. And then we also knew angle K congruent to angle N. Angle LMK is congruent to angle JMN, and that was because of vertical angles. I'm just going to put a little VA. And angle L congruent to angle J, and that was because of our triangle angle theorem that we just looked at. So therefore, I can say that triangle KML is congruent to triangle NMJ. And this here is our congruence statement. In the second triangle, we see that we have some congruent sides, but they're not corresponding with the other triangle. Like here, MI is congruent to side MA, which just tells me that triangle is isosceles. And same thing in the other triangle, that side MO is congruent to side MT. So there's another isosceles triangle, and we have one pair of angles, but that's not enough information to say that these two triangles are congruent. So no, we can't say they're congruent because there are no congruent corresponding parts. Okay, because we said that you needed 3 pairs of congruent corresponding sides and 3 pairs of congruent corresponding angles. All right, number 2, we are going to write a proof. We are given that angle A is congruent to angle D, angle E is congruent to angle C, side AE is congruent to side DC, side EB is congruent to side CB, and side BA is congruent to side BD. So let's go ahead and mark our triangle. So they told us angle A is congruent to angle D, angle E is congruent to angle C, and notice how I mark my triangles. I used one angle mark for A and D, I used 2 for E and C. And then for my sides, I'll use one mark to say AE is congruent to CD, 2 marks for EB congruent to CB, and then 3 marks BA congruent to BD. Okay, so the first thing whenever we write a proof is to list in our statements column everything that we've been given. And I can actually even just do this all on one line. So angle A is congruent to angle D, angle E is congruent to angle C, side AE is congruent to side DC, side EB is congruent to side CB, and side BA is congruent to side BD. And my reason for being able to write all that was all given. Okay, so if I look back at my diagram, I have 3 pairs of congruent corresponding sides, but only 2 pairs of congruent corresponding angles. I need a third pair. Well, if we look over at angle B, I can say angle ABE. So this angle here, and I need to use 3 marks now, is going to be congruent to angle DBC. So I'm going to go ahead and write that out. So angle ABE is congruent to angle DC. Fix that up. Angle DBC. And we have more than one option here. We can either say, because vertical angles aren't congruent, or we just learned that our triangle angle theorem. So either reason there is acceptable, and you actually only need one, but I'm going to put both down to show you we had more than one option. So then once you have your three parts, so your three congruent corresponding sides and your three congruent corresponding angles, we can say that triangle AEB is congruent to triangle DCB. And my reason, definition of congruent triangles. And then we are done with our first proof. Okay, for our second proof and our last example in this section, we are going to look at the triangle on the right. So we are given that angle C is congruent to angle D, so we'll go ahead and mark that. Side CG is congruent to side DG. Side CN is congruent to side DN, and we are told that angle CNG and angle DNG are right angles. So I'm going to put a right angle symbol on this side as well. Okay, so our first step, let's write out our givens. So angle C congruent to angle D, side CG congruent to side DG, side CN congruent to side DN, and angle CNG and angle DNG are right angles. And this was all given. Okay, so that last statement told us that angle CNG and angle DNG are right angles, but it did not say that they were actually congruent. So I have to list that part. So I'm going to say angle CMG is congruent to angle DNG. My reason, definition of right angles, or you could say all right angles are congruent. All right, so back to my figure. I have two pairs of congruent corresponding sides and two pairs of congruent corresponding angles. To get my third side, we notice that our two triangles, so triangle CNG and triangle DNG, they share side GN. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that. So I can say side GN, fix that a little. So side GN is congruent to side GN, which kind of makes sense, right? If two triangles share the same side, that side will be congruent to itself. Well, the reason is what's known as the reflexive property of congruence. Now, this is an important property you will see pop up often when we get into writing more of our triangle congruence proofs. So, reflexive property of congruence. Now, I'm only missing one angle, and if we have two congruent angles in one triangle, congruent to two other angles in another triangle, then the third angle is congruent. So this third angle up top at G will be congruent. So we can say angle CGN is congruent to angle DGN. Oops. Doesn't really look like an N. There we go. And this would be the triangle angle theorem. All right, so now we have all our parts, and I can say triangle CNG is congruent to triangle DNG. And that will be definition of congruent triangles. All right, we're all done with our proof.